Welcome to the Sales Readiness podcast brought to you by SBI. Each episode features an unfiltered conversation between our host, SBI's Managing Director Ray Makela, and an industry expert about the strategies, skills, and solutions that drive sales performance to the next level. These conversations are packed with expert advice, real-world examples, and practical tips to help you close deals, lead teams, and outperform the competition. In this episode, Ray is once again joined by SBI partner Ethan Radoff to tackle the key differences between sales and account management, and why getting this distinction right is critical for revenue growth. Listen in as they break down this unique skill set, strategies, and metrics required for new business acquisition and customer expansion. Learn how top-performing organizations align these roles to maximize both new logo wins and long-term account growth.
Hey, Ethan, welcome back to the Sales Readiness podcast. How are you today?
Doing well, Ray. Thanks for having me back, and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun topic, and interested to get your perspectives on it. We've had a blog and published over time, kind of on the topic of sales versus account management. And surprisingly, it's been a very, very popular, maybe not surprisingly, but it's been a very popular topic, and one that I think people are struggling with. Well, wait, what do we really mean by it? Who's a fit for one or the other? And kind of how we should think about that as we build out the organization and think about individual contributors. So that's the topic we're going to lean in on today. Can you say a little bit about your background and kind of how you're coming to this topic?
Yeah, happy to. And I think we're gonna have a lot to discuss today on the topic. You hit it very nicely. It's a tough one to figure out, so we'll certainly get into that in more detail in a minute here. But a little bit about me: I'm a partner at SBI, so manage our client relationships and delivery of solutions across the portfolio of things that we cover in the go-to-market world. So everything from the strategy to the execution. And I've spent the last 6 or so years in consulting and 10 years as a seller and account manager before that. So certainly have a lot of on the field experience, if you will, to share today. And yeah, hopefully some good nuggets in there for the audience.
Look forward to getting those insights. So let's kick that off. I mean, in terms of the fundamental differences between sales and account management, why is this even important to make a distinction between the two roles?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the easiest way to define that would be it's tough for one person to do everything across the lead to renewal process, and increasingly hard as you think about all the dynamics and software and just sales in general. Is your product complex? Are your customers incredibly large? Are they very small? How much do they reach out to you? So, all these factors come into play, and you think about, the responsibility for one individual, um, and all those different KPIs and metrics you need them to drive. It ends up being overwhelming and tough for them to do any one thing really well. So what you see is, this distinction between, okay, I've got one person who handles something from the time that it's a lead through to, let's call it closed one in the sales cycle, and then another individual or individuals, we'll get into that in a minute here, but someone who can think about all those different interactions from the time that they're a customer to the time that they renew, and hopefully continue renewing and be an advocate for you. And as you can imagine, there's just so many different things and touch points and moments that matter across that continuum, where it's really tough for one individual to own it in its entirety. So that's where you start to see the separation between the two different roles.
Yeah, absolutely. And they both are important, but to your point, it's really tough to balance. And we've all seen that where even from a whole company perspective, they spend so much time servicing their existing company customers, they lose the top of the funnel, or vice versa. There's lots of opportunity in their account base that they're not realizing. So I think we need to balance that. Let's talk about the success factors. I mean, in your experience, what makes somebody more successful as a salesperson versus an account manager? What really matters there?
Yeah, and I think it's important to be mindful of, what's the experience that they're managing, um, before you think about the competency. And we talk a lot about, walking a mile in the buyer's shoes and really understanding who the person is on the other end of the phone, meeting room, boardroom, et cetera, um, to figure out, what competencies and skills resonates. So if you think about the lead to renewal process, you know, typically this is managed by someone who's talking to prospects, folks that don't work with you yet. So we would think of them as maybe a true hunter. Um, so resilience is something that comes to mind because
Right.
they're likely on a high level of commission compensation structure, and they got to go out and create the business every day, and do all the demand generation on their own. That they got to go out and kick down doors, find folks to talk to, build relationships and interest, and then get the prospect to a point where they make a decision, whether that's do nothing, do it themselves, stay with their current vendor, etc. Hopefully work with us. Um, so the skills that you exhibit there are a lot different than what you might exhibit with someone who already works with you. So you have the luxury of, hey, they're in a contract with us now. Doesn't mean we don't have to show up and deliver value every day, but that's the key word I'll harp on for account management and the post sale experience. Whether you're more, let's say, commercial oriented, so you're thinking about how do we maybe grow this relationship, or you're a bit more on the success side, how do we deliver value to this individual, show them that they made a good choice, we solve their problems, we help them solve problems they didn't know about, um, whatever it might be based on your solution. And those two things become increasingly intertwined, that if I get value, I'm more likely to expand my relationship and vice versa. But the mindset of the customers and prospect is very different from I don't work with you to I work with you. And so what you're doing in the day to day becomes different. And hence we need different skill sets to manage those different interactions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think building those additional skills to manage and expand the account is critical, um, because that may not be skills that a hunter necessarily has. Let's talk about that for a little bit. I mean, are some of the skills transferable if somebody moves from more of a hunter or account executive into an account manager role? And then what are some of the things that they need to develop if they're going to be a world-class account manager?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a hotly contested topic in the marketplace. I think there's certainly quite a bit of overlap, and again, to hopefully not harp on the word value too much, you're bringing value to all of these conversations that you have in the pre and sales cycle process of the pursuit, all the way through to the post sale experience. So making that jump, I think you become increasingly more focused on the value that you're delivering to the customer at that
Hmm.
point. So yes, you work with a number of roles in the pre-sales process, but post-sale, you're working with solutions architects, you're working with partners, you're working with customer support resources, you're working with marketing, whatever it might be. You're increasingly orchestrating resources internally at your organization to bring value to that customer. And that's why you see some of these project manager type roles, or even former consultants are being hired into a number of software companies to orchestrate all of those mini projects and work streams, if you will, to deliver value um, to a client. And I think one of the other pieces too is there um, becomes a bit more of a technical bent to the role. Not to say that salespeople shouldn't be technical or well read on their product, but usually have a solutions engineer or consultant to help them be the more technical person while they stay commercial. Um, but as you think about delivering value, you don't want to have to ping pong folks throughout the organization to get the resource. I think the more you can stand alone in some sense, now, not solve
Hmm.
everything, is an important piece. So again, it's the delivering value, maybe becoming a bit more technical. And the last piece I'll say is thinking a bit more strategic. And again, sellers have to think strategically about the chess match that they're in to figure this buying journey out. But
Right.
when you think about growing into a solution, whether it's a simple software solution or this is mission critical to the enterprise, going from implementation to realized value is a long journey, and all the moments and people who need to be involved to get there is a very strategic problem and process to solve. So you're flexing that muscle a bit more as you move into the post sale experience, whether it's more CSM oriented, so success side, or more account management and commercial.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting when we talk about value because we've seen it where a seller needs to be able to identify the, significance of the problem and then position their solution to show the value they're bringing. But on the account manager, and this goes for kind of the client success side as well, they need to be able to prove that value. Like, is the product being utilized? Is it making a difference? Are we actually moving the needle? And what we know about renewals and expansion is if you can't prove that value, it's going to be really hard to get traction and have that conversation. So I think your point about they kind of need to be a little bit broader in their perspective and be able to do maybe some of that analytics themselves or be able to build that business case, right?
Yeah, and it's a great point you make, right? Because if I'm an account manager, let's say I'm more of a farmer seller type, which means, I'm responsible for expanding the relationship on the commercial front, and I may have a success resource to help me with some of the more value driven activities. I'm somewhat dead in the water until we've proven value. I don't know if everyone's going to readily sign up for more until
Right.
they're getting
Right.
value out of what they have today. So you're
Yep.
in that process, and um, you've got no choice but to be in the boat with the team to help figure that out. The last thing you want to hear from a customer is, when you're asking them, and we do this a lot in interviews, is who's driving the most value in these conversations. You don't want to be the person that is the afterthought. You want to be the person who's helping them get the most out of it, so you can share those successes with other folks in the organization and their leadership and help grow into new expansion or cross sell opportunities.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the more we can prove that, obviously, the better off, easier it will be, ideally, to get that renewal or expand the account. Well, let's transition. I mean, one of the things I wanted to hit on in our recent buyer friction research, we talk about some of the friction points in a B2B sale these days, and one of them is we're confusing our customers by throwing too many bodies at them. We're, having too many points of entry, and often the customer is like, I don't know what all these people do. Where are they coming from? They don't know what each other are doing. So I think we hear that, and it's challenging enough to sell these days without kind of injecting additional friction ourselves. So let's talk about the collaboration and handoff. I mean, how does that work in an account manager role, or ideally, how do we make sure there is an alignment between the initial new logo, the account executive kicking off, and the account manager getting engaged?
Yeah, this is a great question because it's few and far between that we're engaged with someone and they've got this perfectly figured out. This is a
Hmm.
problem that exists almost everywhere that we interact in our client base, and even the prospects we talk to. And it's a tough thing to figure out, but I I think it's worth taking a step back as an organization and thinking about what makes the most sense and documenting that. We can't solve what we ourselves haven't figured out, which starts with understanding, how are we going to best set ourselves up to deliver the most value to this person? Is it truly we need to bring 30 people to the conversation? Or does it maybe make sense for these three people to be involved up to this point? We make the handoff at this point and we have this conversation. So, mapping those touch points when you build your sales process against what the buyer wants and needs is incredibly important. Documenting that, enabling against it, making sure it actually happens at the field level. I can't stress enough how important that process is. So once you've got your ducks in a row there, then I think it's a matter of how do we get the most out of all those interactions. So, um, if you think about the later stages of the sales process, right? And this might make sense for some organizations, for others, it may not. Starting to introduce those folks towards the latter half of the buying or sales process, excuse me, is important. And making it known, hey, here's who this person is. Here's what their role is. Here is why I am bringing them to the conversation, and make sure that they've got a role to play. As you get into the contract stages, you're likely, talking about implementation, onboarding, success activities. So having that person you're bringing in, whether it's the account manager, success representative, drive those discussions. Now you're there as the seller for continuity and context and relationship. They've spent a lot of time with you, but you slowly start to make that transition through those last few stages and into implementation and onboarding. And if you as the seller need to stick around for more continuity and context, it's in your best interest to do so. What we see a lot is that there's this, you know, heave over the wall, if you will, where the contract is signed and someone just catches it on the other end and moves into implementation. And again, to your point on buyer friction, that's a pretty friction filled process. So, how do we simplify? How do we, figure out what are those moments that need to take place? Who needs to be a part of those moments? And what do we need to do? So making sure that's known, documented, and we go out and execute that is, really important piece of the puzzle to reducing that friction and delivering value.
Well, I love that, Ethan, because it also speaks to it shouldn't surprise us that we have those different milestones and different things in place. But sometimes it feels that way to the team because that team hasn't worked together before, or they're coming together as a matrix to service that account. But somewhere I ran across the term moments that matter, right? What are those moments that matter in that handoff? You're kicking off, you're delivering product, you're supporting, maybe there's an executive review. Like those are moments that matter in that client life cycle. Who owns those? Like, do we have a simple, responsibility and make sure there's orchestration on that so we're not stepping on each other and it's like, oh, no, I'm going to do that. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion starts, right?
100%. And it's not for the sake of just writing it down, right? Now, that's the easy, well, maybe not so easy part of getting people to agree who don't collaborate as often as maybe we think they should. But
Right.
going out and doing it, a lot of this stuff isn't, I like to say rocket science. I think we know what is in the best interest of our customers and what leads to good outcomes. If you've, been working at that organization for a while, you can look at a lighthouse client and say, hey, it's working really well there. What did they do? And it's usually, hey, they did the things that we know work. So write them down and then go and put them into practice.
Yeah. No, that's a great way to look at it. Well, let's keep moving here. I wanted to talk about, kind of measuring success. And so we know that, an account executive or hunter is kind of focused on those new logos. Account managers are looking hopefully to grow the account. But what are some of the things we should be measuring? What does a good balanced scorecard look like? How do we look at that across those two roles?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think the hunter pieces are a bit more obvious, right? There's leading and lagging indicators of how many meaningful meetings are taking place in a week, how many, even upstream, how many meaningful contacts are we having with our target accounts? How much pipeline are we generating? Are we keeping a consistent, 3 to 5x coverage? Are we moving opportunities through the pipeline? And ultimately, are we closing those opportunities at the end of it? So
Yep.
I think that piece is pretty well understood. And as you move into the post sale experience, it becomes tricky because you maybe have a number of roles involved, where you have a commercially minded account manager who might be thinking about cross sell and upsell. So, am I introducing new products? Am I expanding the use of a current product, whatever the solution might be? But there's a number of other metrics that you need to keep top of mind. So, general customer satisfaction, the health of the customer account, whether that's a combination of metrics or is driven from product telemetry. Um, you're thinking about the renewal as well. You're thinking about kind of general success, adoption. So there's a lot of metrics that lead to the outcomes. It's tough to say that one person will manage it all, um, but ultimately, you're looking to drive the net revenue retention, so the NRR across that account. But there's a lot of people involved to do it. So, I would say the big ones that you're thinking about are expansion opportunities, so cross sell and upsell. You're thinking about account and customer health, which is usually a combination of a number of metrics. CSAT generally is an important one, and then you're thinking about the renewal. So those are probably the biggest ones I'd be thinking about. And then of course there's the leading, indicators. Am I having those QBRs with the client? Did the right people show up? Were they engaged in that conversation? So to your point of moments that matter, you shouldn't be surprised if those metrics that I referenced are falling behind, and you're not doing those things or uh, doing them with impact. It's one thing to check the box; it's another to, how to be a valuable box check as well.
Yeah, well, no, and I mean, there are some similarities. We know that if you have meetings with the right persona and the right message, you're likely going to uncover opportunities. On the account side, if you're doing your QBRs, if you're really talking to all the stakeholders that are engaged, you will uncover those opportunities. But let's transition and talk a little bit about that in terms of specific strategies. And I know you get involved in playbook development and other consulting opportunities. Thinking about what can the account manager do? What are some of the tools, maybe approaches to find that white space and to be able to expand the account?
Yeah, I think a lot of it actually starts with the handoff that you're taking from the hunter and the hunter supporting cast. So, hopefully they've been keeping detailed notes and documentation and, uh, running rigorous moments that matter on their end of the sales process so that you inherit a wealth of information to build from. Otherwise you've got a big mountain to climb in expansion and cross sell because you're effectively starting from scratch. So,
Yeah.
I think the first thing that you want to do is really have a conversation or a number of conversations with the account team on the new business side to understand, hey, who did we talk to? What's the relationship score with those individuals? Who do we need to lean into a bit more? Who was a skeptic? Who was a champion? So that you can start to map all the different relationships, both those that we have and those that we don't or would like to have, so that you've got a pretty, hopefully complete view of the stakeholder landscape of this account as you inherit it, and then work to develop that over time. And then in those meetings, you're also taking note of, hey, what were all of the KPIs, or what was the business case that we developed for them? What were all the things that they were interested in? What did we propose that they didn't sign up for? So we have already got maybe our first 3 to 5 expansion opportunities mapped
Hmm.
out, and you've got some insight on how you can maybe bridge the gap to get there over time. So I think a lot of it goes into that handoff, and you'd be surprised, or maybe you're not surprised, that sometimes those meetings don't really happen. So I think getting off on the right foot is important. If you're an account manager that's accompanied by a CSM, you want a pretty strong relationship there. So having a regular cadence with that individual, uh, and then having a plan, right? You've got a plan for your customer to realize value, but you're also going to have an internal plan of how we want to, take the value that we want to deliver to them and ladder it up to your objectives, not the other way around. We don't want to start with our objectives. We want to start with
Right.
theirs. So that you've got a, quarterly, monthly, biannually, whatever the cadence is that makes sense approach to get there. And you
Yep.
can partner with them and the other cross-functional teams you work with to help build the plan. But it all starts with the handoff and the great work hopefully done on the front end of the sales process.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it really paints a picture for me that because we're inside, that whether it's the CSM or the account manager, but you see so much being in there, but we need to leverage that information and connect the dots and build that strategy that's going to position us to say, by the way, we thought about X, Y, and Z. And, you have such a leg up compared to if you're coming in from the outside going, what keeps you up at night? And, it's not a question
Yeah.
anybody really wants to answer.
No, and it's an overused question as well, because you
For
should
sure.
know at this point what keeps them
Yeah.
up at night. So I don't encourage that question, but you're totally right. You need an account plan. You need a success plan. Sometimes those are connected. Other times they're separate. Of how we're going to go tackle that. But you need to start with, hey, why did they sign up with us? What do they want to achieve? That should be documented, or we're going to go figure it out. It's public. It's probably stated in their 10K or quarterly report what they're working on, what they're working towards. So, a lot of times the insight you bring and to connect the dots is because you were curious about the organization. Hey, did you realize that this was a problem we can help you with? I know you're working on that. Let's talk about what that entails. It's not even pushing product. You're helping them understand that there's actually another business problem you face that we can help you with. And it could be an underutilized part of your tool, or maybe it's a new piece of the technology suite that you offer. But you got to be curious. You got to have a plan, and then you got to have a plan to execute. on the plan. So
Love it.
lots of things to be done when you're inside the four walls.
Yeah, well, Ethan, we've covered a lot of ground. Maybe you could net it out. Is there a couple of tips you'd leave our audience with today in terms of, thinking about this and suggestions on the sales versus account manager discussion?
Yeah, it's tough to net it out. There's a lot to cover. I think the important piece is, hey, let's just be clear on what the process should be. We don't execute it flawlessly every time, but we should know the minimum viable product that we should execute against. Um, Go out and make it happen. If you need to kick down some doors internally and, make some new relationships, do it, especially if it's in the best interest of your customer. I would also say do your best to keep detailed information at each step of the process and to the point of bringing value. It's hard to do that if we're not conscious of, information that we have that this person doesn't have. So, and then be mindful of what you're trying to accomplish. Again, we talked about these are different roles with different responsibilities and different objectives. So you got to build a plan to get there. You got to know what the moments that matter are to help influence those, and they're different for each of the roles before you can even go execute against them. So just a couple things as we think about where we're at in the fiscal year for those on Jan 1 as you think about, what are the moments that matter for this account this year and how are we going to go execute against them?
No, I think that's a great place to wrap. I mean, especially looking at, all right, so now we're into February. How can we expand those opportunities throughout the year? Because that's going to make a bigger difference, right, than anything probably. So kind of getting our arms around this, getting this right, and setting us up for success. So really enjoyed the discussion today. Appreciate your insights as always, and look forward to our next conversation.
Likewise, Red. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to SBI's Sales Readiness Podcast with Managing Director Ray Makela hosting. Visit sbigrowth.com to read SBI's latest research, join upcoming events, or learn about SBI's GTM and training services. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and connect with us on LinkedIn.